Good evening, fantasy football fans. Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Slant, brought to you by Pro Football Focus Fantasy and powered by DraftKings. This is your typical host, Scott Spratt, joined tonight by the intellectual Michael Moore, rocking some glasses. Michael, man, you look so smart tonight. Do you feel smart?
Well, yeah, like I was just telling you, Scott, I totally predicted Robert Woods' touchdown tonight, so that's why I felt the glasses were needed.
That's why you're an elite fantasy analyst in the business, Michael.
Right.
Anyway, talking about what we're really going to talk about on the show tonight, we got to have to lead off with some Browns talk. Obviously, Josh Gordon is pretty big news this week. We'll hit on that. We're going to hit on Isaiah Crowell as well, who seems to maybe have established himself now with Ben Tate out of town. Later in the show, we're going to talk about some potential waiver wire ads you can make for the playoff runs. There were, I thought, a surprising number of players that kind of emerged out of nowhere this week that, you know, more so than usual in a sort of a Week 12 time frame that could maybe really help you down the stretch. And then finally, Michael, you and I and most of the staffers at PFF that do Dynasty rankings made an update over the weekend. So, I mean, this is, again, we're entering the fantasy playoffs. Hopefully teams are in the playoffs, but if they're not, this is a really good time to be trying to make Dynasty moves. So, again, we're going to hit on some of the major differences we had for all of the major four offensive positions. But as I teased, I think we need to get started with some Browns talk. It's Browns Corner, Michael. We've had a really fun time this year talking about all of the best teams in the league, be they Jacksonville, Cleveland, etc. Well, the Browns keep winning, and it may actually get a lot better now that Josh Gordon is back.
Hold on, Scott. Can we call it winning or can we call it not losing?
Well, I did look at their schedule earlier today because I was like, man, they have a lot of wins. And I was like, oh, they just keep beating the NFC South. I'm not really sure that counts. But
and I'm pretty sure Mike Smith just gifted that one to them. But that's a different podcast. So
let me take a quick Panthers aside, as I am wont to do. I mean, of course the Falcons lost again, and if the Saints get rocked tonight by the Ravens, then the Panthers are going to once again be right there with the chance to make the playoffs. I want it to be over, but they just won't let me. They won't let me escape, Michael. I don't know what to do.
What a country, Scott.
Meanwhile, some team like Detroit's not going to make the playoffs, and I'm going to feel bad.
Well, no, they probably shouldn't after yesterday, but we'll get to that later.
Well, the Panthers did beat them as well. But Josh Gordon, Michael, we got to get back on topic because there's a lot to talk about. Remember when they said that he was only going to play 20 to 30 snaps? I guess you probably shouldn't listen to coaches ever. Anyway, Gordon had 8 catches for 120 yards, did not score but had 16 targets. Those 16 targets came out of the 41 total pass attempts for the Browns, so they may have passed a little bit more in this game than they typically do, but clearly Gordon reestablished himself to at or near the level he did last season. So there's probably not a lot to talk about there, but I want to nail you down, Michael, on where exactly you would rank him relative to the other elite receivers for the rest of this season. So let's just start off at the top, and you tell me whether or not you prefer Gordon to this player. Would you rather have Demaryius Thomas or Gordon the rest of the way?
Demaryius Thomas. Personally, I think for this year, as far as redraft go, Demaryius is the top guy for me.
He's also the number 1 guy in fantasy scoring, so I agree there too. Josh Gordon or Jordy Nelson?
Ooh. I probably would still go Jordy, just because I think they're probably about equal as players, but obviously I think it's safe to say Jordy has the better quarterback throwing him the ball. So I'd go Jordy, but it wouldn't be by a lot.
Okay. Josh Gordon or Calvin Johnson?
Ooh. I don't know if this qualifies as a hot take or not. I'd probably go Gordon the rest of the way. Calvin Johnson is just not 100%, and look, the Lions in general are just not 100%. And if Josh Gordon can sit out for 3 months with no football action and return immediately with Brian Hoyer as quarterback and go off for 8 for 120, I'm thinking he'll be okay the rest of the year. So I would probably go Gordon, and I would probably sleep very well at night.
I see what you're saying. By the way, Gordon is healthy. That's one thing that he has an advantage over Calvin, who's actually had to play some football this year. I think I'm a sucker, but I'm going to take Calvin there. I think the 10-catch, 170-yard, 2-touchdown game is coming for Calvin in the next 3 weeks or so. So I think I'm still in a big way there. I think it's coming. Josh Gordon or Antonio Brown?
Ooh, That's a tough one. I might go Brown actually on that one, just because I think, and especially for PPR leagues, and I know you didn't discern a difference, but yeah, Brown for me is just consistently been a number one guy, and look, I would much rather take more of a sure thing like Brown than a super high upside guy like Gordon. So I'd probably still go Brown on that one.
Brown was actually the number one fantasy receiver entering the week, but now that he went on bye, Demarius caught him. But he's been right there all year. Josh Gordon or Des Bryant?
Ooh, man, though, can I say even on that one? on that
Yeah,
one?
totally fine.
To me, that's even, man. I love both. That's not a knock on either one. I really, really like both of those guys, and I don't know. To me, they're kind of the same player, meaning not physically, obviously, but just, I mean, they could be, I guess.
More so than most receivers that are on this list.
Yeah, but I mean, they're just both very capable of very big plays and very big games, just at any given time. So yeah, they're about even for me. That would be a tough one.
Okay, Gordon or Randall Cobb?
Oh, probably Gordon for me, and that to me that's not even close. And believe me, I understand the appeal of Cobb. I mean, he's a big play guy too, but he still essentially has to fight over targets with Jordy, and given they're passing 40 times a game, so it's not like there's not enough to go around. But for me to have Gordon, who's a bona fide number one, yeah, I would take Gordon over Cobb on that one.
Okay, let's go a little bit quicker the rest of the way. I don't think many of these guys are going to be the other guy, but Gordon or AJ Green?
Gordon.
Gordon or either Chicago wide receiver?
Gordon. It's probably going to be Gordon the rest of the way, Scott.
Maybe you're right. Gordon. I got a couple more interesting ones, but Gordon or Julio Jones?
Ooh, Gordon only, yeah, Gordon, any day of the week.
That one's definitive for me, Gordon. Gordon or rookie Mike Evans?
That's closer than I think I originally would think, but it would still be Gordon for me.
Yeah, Evans has the bad quarterback problem still, so he doesn't have an advantage. He doesn't have an advantage there over Gordon, which means I think you have to take the more established player. Gordon or T.Y. Hilton, Jeremy Maclin, Emmanuel Sanders.
Yeah, Gordon.
Any of those guys?
No, Gordon would be it for me all the way.
Yeah, Macklin's kind of fallen back slightly with the recent emergence of Jordan Matthews there in Philadelphia.
Well, and I don't know.
In fact, Mark Sanchez.
I was going to say, I don't know what he did to Mark Sanchez, but it must have been pretty egregious. So.
Then two other rookies, Odell Beckham and Kelvin Benjamin. Gordon or either of those guys?
Yeah, Gordon. Like I said, I think I named maybe 3 to 4 guys. It's even close with Gordon, and look, he's proven to me he's pretty good. So
yeah, you have Gordon top 5 the rest of the way. I have him probably 5th, 6th, 7th, somewhere in there as well. It's tough to dislike him the rest of the way this season. He's just so amazing. Mm-hmm. But this is a little bit of a teaser going forward in the show, but I wanted to bring this forward since we're already talking about him. In Dynasty, and again, we've updated our Dynasty rankings. You've moved Gordon up to 9th, and I've moved Gordon up to 18th. So again, we have a pretty big discrepancy there. In my mind, the only reason I'm down on Gordon at all is I feel like the fact that he has an established track record as someone receiving discipline in the NFL, it makes it a lot easier for him to get in more substantial trouble going forward. Like with equal offenses relative to other players, the penalty would be more severe. So it's really just off-field concerns in my mind. That's probably why you don't have Gordon, frankly, in the top 5 in your Dynasty rankings. Am I right?
Yeah. There's really no other reason. I mean, I think the quarterback play is going to improve over the course of his career. I mean, if we're being honest, I don't know how much worse it can get right now. But yeah, look, he's a multiple offender. There's no other way to say it, and he's more susceptible to being suspended or something like that than other guys. That's just reality. So. But even 9th, I feel like, is still pretty low for him. But, yeah, like you said, the off-field stuff definitely it's definitely in the back of your mind, that's for sure.
Yeah, next year's going to be interesting in Dynasty because there was just so many good wide receivers added to the mix this year because of an unbelievable rookie class. It sort of changed what we used to think of as the top tier of receivers. Now they're actually 15 guys that you're like, yeah, I could see him being the number 1 player in fantasy this year.
Yeah.
So. And also another quick aside here, I got in an argument with a coworker today on Brian Hoyer. He was trying to say that Hoyer was a little bit sneaky, was kind of a good player. I gave him the Brian Hoyer has a worse completion percentage than Geno Smith stat this year, and I think I pretty definitively won that argument. Thoughts, Michael?
He does know you worked for Pro Football Focus, right? Like, was he?
To be fair, I work at a company that does baseball stats, so it's not like he's not statistically minded as well. But I say argument won by me.
He had 3 interceptions yesterday. You don't have to be statistically minded to know that sucks. I mean, come on.
Anyway, I had fun. Okay, still Browns corner. We need to talk about Isaiah Crowell because the team traded Ben Tate. And all of a sudden, the team that's been the most run-heavy only has really 2 running backs. And obviously, we've seen 2 running backs in a single offense be effective before. This week, Crowell, I think, got 12 carries. He scored twice, was very great in fantasy, 5 yards per carry for this season as well. But Terrence West actually got 2 more carries this game, even though he's had 3.7 yards per carry for the season, much worse. Do we have enough here to say that Crowell can be in the top 20 at the position, or do you think that there's still too much work going West's way for Crowell to really establish himself?
No, and I'll give full credit to you, Scotty. You called this one weeks ago, but no, I'm sold on Crowell now. And look, even though, like you said, he had 2 more touches, West did, than Crowell. To me, cutting Tate, that was a significant move. If they hadn't cut Tate, even if they didn't play him at all yesterday, but he was still on the roster, that would still be in the back of your mind that someone like that could siphon off carries. But to actually cut Tate and move on, to me that showed they're ready to handle at least obviously more of the load of Crowell, if not the full-time gig. And look, I give full credit to the Browns staff. They take some risks. I mean, throwing Gordon out there the entire game was a risk, and I think running with Crowell at least to start the game was a risk. But it paid off. He did very well. So no, to me, Crowell is a definite top 20 guy. Let's also not forget, like you and I have talked about many times, the running back position, at least from a fantasy football perspective, is a very fickle one. Meaning, look, you could have a Jonas Gray rush for 4 touchdowns one week and then not get a carry the next. I mean, you just never know. So for a guy like Crowell, I mean, relatively speaking, he's gotten a lot more carries than a lot of his other running backs in the league. So no, he's a definite top 20 guy for me, and probably closer to top 15, quite honestly.
No, it's cool. Bill Belichick on DraftKings was all over LeGarrette Blount this week, so you really should have seen that one coming, Michael.
And Tim Wright, apparently. So
we'll be talking about him later, so teaser there. For the rest of this season, would you rather have Crowell or Frank Gore?
Ooh, why would you do this to me, Scott? That's not fair.
I know it's your boy. He's my boy too, but the 49ers figured out their boy. Yeah, probably I think you have to.
I mean, Gore has one good game a month, maybe, and it certainly wasn't yesterday when he had ample opportunity. So, no, I would go Crowell, and I wouldn't even think twice about it.
I'm not sure that Gore has a bigger slice of the 49ers pie than Crowell does, frankly, and we know that Crowell's matchups are going to be a lot easier down the stretch. Crowell or Jerick McKinnon?
Oh, Crowell. Yeah, and that one's not close either. I think McKinnon's a serviceable player. To me, the talent level is just so more in Crowell's corner than McKinnon that I would take.
Wow. I don't agree with that. In fact, McKinnon may be the other rookie running back that I think is like that talented, but I think his situation is so much worse that Crowell's the way to go there. How about Crowell or former Browns running back legend Trent Richardson?
Well, look, apparently Trent Richards is not even starting, so give me Isaiah Crowell any day.
Yeah, we'll talk about Dan Heron in a bit, too.
I don't buy the whole, Trent Richardson was sick that day. No, come on. They don't want to start him. So, no, Crowell would be that guy all day.
Yeah. Yeah, the Browns may be the enlightened franchise now. They're willing to trade away Trent Richardson when everyone still thinks he's good. They're willing to cut Ben Tate when teams still think he's good. They're smart. Finally, Crowell or Joyke Bell?
Oh, Crowell. Yeah. That's not even close for me either.
We've clearly established that Crowell's in the top 20. I think that's fair to say.
Definitely.
Okay, Michael, next up. I mentioned earlier how I thought there were a lot of players that kind of came out of nowhere this week that could maybe help you. Maybe you're still on the wire even in some deeper formats. I think I have to start with the player that sort of shone on Thursday, and the Raiders. Congratulations, Raiders, their first win of the season. That was Latavius Murray, who turned his 4 carries into 112 yards and 2 touchdowns. Unfortunately, he had to exit the game in the first half with a concussion, but obviously that's a pretty good fantasy performance, 112 and 2. And even though one of those runs was, I think, a 90-yarder or so with a touchdown, he still was getting a lot of the early work, so it looked very promising. What are your thoughts on Murray for the rest of the season?
I think it's clear he's the more talented back over either McFadden or Jones-Drew, but again, that's not saying a whole lot. I think for fantasy players, they have to be very careful and make sure that, a guy like Sperano, who, look, for all intents and purposes, is coaching for a job at this point. I think they just got to be careful that he actually plays Murray. Now, he's in concussion protocol, so it's still up for it still remains to be seen if he'll play next week. But I really hope they give him more opportunity. I mean, look, they're not going to the playoffs. They've won 1 game. There's no reason for him not to play and not to start. But again, I would still be cautious until I hear the words come out of Tony Sperano's mouth that yes, Latavius Murray is starting.
Michael, I'm throwing caution to the wind. I'm spending all my fab money on Murray if I can. I'm putting my number 1 waiver priority on him. Since they played on Thursday last week, I feel like that gives them a better chance of starting this upcoming week. I think that they need to evaluate how good Murray is, because going into this next offseason, McFadden could potentially be gone. He's not under contract. Jones-Drew, unfortunately for them, is under contract, but he's been really bad. Actually, McFadden has 1.77 yards after contact per attempt this year. That's the 3rd worst among qualifiers. Jones-Drew doesn't qualify, but 1.28 yards after contact per attempt would be by far the lowest. I mean, obviously a lot of that is just the Raiders' offense is terrible and predictable, but I think you have to take a run at Murray here as a possible running back too the rest of the season, and there aren't any of those guys out there, so I think you really have to make that play. All right, I mentioned a second ago too, Dan Herron had a very nice game in his first quasi-start for Indianapolis. Again, that was against the Jaguars, but still, 12 carries for 65 yards, also 5 catches for 31 yards on 5 targets. If you can get those 5 targets a game, you can get that sort of Ahmad Bradshaw value where maybe he's only getting low double-digit carries, but with the total touches, that can be very useful in fantasy. But what are your thoughts on Herron the rest of this season?
Yeah, I'm a fan. I mean, look, any starting running back in that offense, I think, has an opportunity anyway to produce, and he certainly didn't disappoint yesterday. It was kind of a surprise. It was one of those last-minute start kind of deals that I'm sure threw a lot of people on the daily fantasy games off. But look, he did well with it, and more importantly, they won the game and they put up 23 points. So I don't know that they're necessarily going to be in a rush to make a change or do anything different. And look, Herron is one of the few. Well, I mean, Bradshaw, I think it's very unlikely he'll be there next year. I think Herron could be at least the incumbent going into next season. So, yeah, I think you got to view him as a definite RB2 the rest of the way.
I'm slightly more pessimistic than that. In this game, Herron played 33 snaps compared to 42 for Trent Richardson. I think that mix is pretty much right going forward, so I think Trent will be the one that's more the leader of the two. From a fantasy perspective, I think they'll be closer to even because Herron's catching potential. Herron actually had 19 catches for 180 yards in his big junior year in college. Mm-hmm. That's sort of his major skill, I would say, is receiving ability. But a lot of Ahmad Bradshaw's fantasy production came from receiving touchdowns specifically this year, which isn't really something I would expect for Herron going forward. It always seemed a little bit flukish to me. So in my mind, he's more in running back flex territory, which actually in shallow leagues means you're not going to play him because you'd rather use the 20 to 40 receivers there than the 20 to 30 running backs. But in deeper formats especially, I think Herron is useful, and you need to pick him up in pretty much every format. But I'm a little bit lower, and frankly, I'd be pretty surprised if Herron had any kind of this job next year. He may be a backup, but I feel like the Colts may be inclined to make an upgrade at the position, especially because Richardson hasn't really turned out as well as they'd hoped. All right, let's hit some of these new receivers that could be interesting for fantasy. Number 1, Jarvis Landry. 7 catches here for 50 yards and 2 touchdowns in that heartbreaking loss to the Broncos. That was on 9 targets. And Landry actually has 24 receptions over the last 4 weeks. That's tied for the 7th most in the league, although obviously a lot of teams have been on buys over that stretch. But still very impressive. Also 4 touchdowns over that stretch. Landry was sort of one of the forgotten rookie receivers this season. I don't think he was in the top 12 or so rookie receivers, but he's really come on strong lately. Do you think he can maybe be a top 30 wide receiver the rest of the season?
I think in PPR leagues, I think he definitely could. I think our own Pro Football Focus looked at the snaps, and he's already on the same snap count as Mike Wallace and a little bit ahead of Brian Hartline already. And look, I don't look for that to change much at all. So yeah, I think in a PPR league, I think Landry's very attractive. And look, as you know, I had him in my buy section of my dynasty article last week. I think he's very good, and look, I think he's a lot more useful to a guy like Tannehill than Mike Wallace probably ever will be. Just because that's the kind of offense they run. They are not a bomb it kind of team. They're a lot of intermediate to short passes, and look, Landry's doing very well with that, obviously. So yeah, I think PPR leagues top 30 is a definite. Non-PPR leagues, I think it's probably a little closer to maybe top 40, just because, again, he's not going to get those long completions, but he is going to get a lot of catches.
I agree. I think Landry has a future kind of similar to Kendall Wright, where I could definitely see 90-catch seasons coming up for him in the future, but he's going to be subject to the quarterback play of his team going forward in a way that Josh Gordon, for instance, is not. I don't think he's the kind of player that could elevate the play of his player. I mean, it's great that Tannehill's playing so well, and maybe then Landry can be a top 30 receiver just going forward. But I don't think that Landry is that kind of difference maker, the way that even Mike Wallace is a difference maker. But for the rest of this season, I do think he's an attractive fantasy play in deeper formats like you too. Okay, next up for the Rams, Stedman Bailey came out of nowhere, definitely, with 6 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown on 8 targets here. The Rams have kind of mixed and matched, I guess you could say, ever since Brian Quick went down a few weeks ago. Kenny Brett, former Titan, has actually had some good games over that stretch as well. Do you think that Bailey is I don't know, is he someone that you would even pick up?
No.
Definitive, nice.
Look, I'm avoiding, I think, anyone on the Rams offensively like the plague. It's just oof. There's just not a lot to like there, at least for me personally. I think Trey Mason probably has a chance, only because I think he's going to get a lot of volume. But as far as the receivers go, look, it's kind of a week-to-week thing. I mean, 2 weeks ago it was Kenny Britt, who had a very long touchdown, if people remember. And then, like you said, this week it was Bailey. I mean, who can you trust there? And look, even at quarterback, they go Austin Davis, they go Sean Hill. I don't know, man. There's just a lot of uncertainty on that team for the rest of the way for me to invest anything in it. I mean, what about you? There's not. I mean, no. Yeah, it's just.
I completely agree with you. Even at tight end, Jared Cook has had a lot of his value taken by stray Lance Kendricks touchdowns.
Right.
So I feel like really Trey Mason is the only player that you can trust in that offense at all. But I have been ranking Mason as a top 20 running back, and I think you have to.
Sure, and that's entirely on volume because, like we've talked about before, the Rams are a very one running back team, and at the moment Mason's it, but anyone else is just scary.
Yeah. All right, another player kind of along these lines, maybe more of the Landry mold, but Charles Johnson of Minnesota. Before a few weeks ago, I had sort of forgotten about this guy. I think he got drafted by the Packers last year, but failed to make the team. He's now on Minnesota. He had 3 catches for 52 yards and a score on Sunday, and that was actually on 10 targets. And over the last 4 games, Johnson has 23 targets, which is tied for with Greg Jennings for the most on the team, whereas Cordarrelle Patterson has 19 over that stretch. Anything to see here with Charles Johnson?
I think so, personally. I mean, I count the Vikings as another one of those teams that doesn't give in to the whole, veteran narrative kind of deal. I mean, they're I think, going to go with the players that give them the best shot. And look, Johnson's always been a physical specimen. I mean, he's been on a lot of draft people's radars for a couple years now. And look, now he's getting a chance. And more importantly, with the Vikings, I think, not that they've given up on the season, but I think they're sort of in evaluation mode at this point, and they want to see what they got with Johnson, which, look, the rest of the way, I think you can argue that they would much rather see what they got with Johnson rather than doing the same thing with Greg Jennings. So yeah, for me, he's definitely on the radar, and it sets up the rare lineup of a rookie quarterback, rookie running back, and rookie receiver. But look, hey, they could just throw caution to the wind and start chucking it and see what happens. And look, I think that can make Johnson a wide receiver 3 or 4 the rest of the way.
Definitely this week when he faces the Panther secondary, at least, right?
Now, don't be a Debbie Downer, Scott. Okay.
It's gotten to just be farcical at this point. But anyway, Michael, this is the moment everyone's been waiting for. It's time for our Dynasty Rankings update, where I pick and choose everything that makes me look good and makes you look dumb. Except you've got the intellectual glasses on, so I don't think that's going to work as well this week.
I came prepared, Scott, so get ready.
Yeah, you really did. It's going to be a challenge. All right, we're going to start at quarterback, but there's actually not a ton here to say at quarterback. A lot of our rankings here are pretty much the same. And given that I think, Michael, you share my mind that outside of the really elite guys, which are, Luck, Peyton Manning, and Aaron Rodgers, and then maybe to a certain extent Tom Brady and Russell Wilson, there's a lot of sort of sameness between, say, the quarterback 6 spot and the quarterback 16 spot even. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time picking and choosing here the differences that we have. I will point out that I have Cam Newton 3rd, and you have him 8th. That's a little bit of a gap there. And I just want to do a little quick exercise, Michael. A lot of the 2nd and 3rd tier quarterbacks that I was just talking about, they're kind of worthless the rest of this season because one reason or another. Like Cam is hurt, Phillip Rivers is hurt, Jay Cutler is Jay Cutler, Colin Kaepernick's just had a really bad year for whatever reason. Same with Matthew Stafford, maybe offensive changes there. Really, you want to avoid all of those guys in the fantasy playoffs if you can do anything about it. But obviously, all of them, again, will be fantasy relevant next year. So let's just do a little quick. Can you rank the quarterbacks, maybe the top 10 quarterbacks for redraft in 2015? Because I think that's going to inform a lot of our opinions here. So let's go ahead and knock off Rodgers, Luck, and Peyton Manning in some order.
Okay.
Do you agree with those 3?
Yeah, those are no doubters.
Okay. Do you feel the same about Tom Brady at 4 and Russell Wilson at 5?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I might. Well, yeah, okay. Well, okay, and this is assuming Rob Gronkowski doesn't break something else between now and the end of the year.
I'm knocking on wood. I happen to be on a wood table just to be convenient.
Yeah, no, I do too. We'll do that at the same time.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so if we're being optimistic, yeah, I think that's fair. I think Brady and Wilson are top 5 for next year.
Okay. So we've got the top 5. Let's go from there. Who is your number 6 quarterback?
Oh, God, and it's like you said, it's not very pretty. I might give Stafford one more chance after that. I mean,
okay, didn't see that coming at all.
There's just, I don't know, man. There's just too much. I would think there's just too much talent there, but he's, believe me, I'm not confident in that. But I know you're probably going to say Cam, right?
Well, I have Drew Brees 6th and then Cam 7th.
Okay.
But the reason I'm going back in on Cam is basically Cam was the top 5 quarterback for his first 3 years, got hurt, and now he's not. Like, to me, there's just nothing else to that than Cam is playing on possibly a busted ankle and definitely busted ribs. I just feel like it's going to get better next year. And maybe the offensive line will prevent that from happening, but that's generally my thought.
Well, and I think you have to hope and pray. That they do something about that offensive line next year, which I think they'll address it in some form or fashion. And don't get me wrong, again, knock on wood that they don't take a step backwards. But yeah, I could see that. Like you said, I think that next tier, whether it's Newton or Breeze or Stafford or Kaepernick, is all sort of lumped together.
So yeah, the 6 through 10 that I came up with are Breeze, Cam, Phillip Rivers, Ben Roethlisberger, who by the way could finish top 5 this year maybe, and that's a bit of an outlier in his career, but that's a point that's interesting certainly. And then I put Romo as well. Romo also a guy that I have some injury concerns about, but speaking of great offensive lines, he's got one, and he's been really good so far this year too. But obviously there's a lot of uncertainty here overall, and there's a lot of similarity here. So I'm not going to really grill you too hard about having Stafford 6th instead of 12th or wherever I have him, but I think that's sort of getting to the point there. The one major difference is that I think Cam will bounce back.
Yeah.
Let's jump over to the running backs. Here we have a lot more differences. The major one to start off with, I thought, was Mark Ingram. I have Ingram at 14th, and you have him at 29th. You know, a lot of the reasons I liked Ingram this year was because he performed so well with some of our advanced metrics at PFF, things like yards after contact per attempt. Some of that has declined this year. You know, Ingram's got a 2.38 yards after contact per attempt this year. It's fine. It's above average, but it's not great. He does have 18 receptions this year, which for him is just sort of a huge amount. But I'm wondering if Michael, this might have a lot to do with what your thoughts are on where Ingram might land next year, because he will be a free agent at the end of this year. And while it hasn't been a boon for him in previous seasons, you feel like it's a good situation to be on New Orleans. Do you have him at 29th because of opinions on his value or opinions on this team situation that he could end up on next year, or what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, it's all of the above, quite honestly. I mean, I think there's no doubt that it's a very good situation that he landed in New Orleans. But look, just like we've seen with Darren Sproles and name another one, Reggie Bush, the Saints aren't to want to re-sign their running backs and keep them around. They like to. It's almost like a revolving door there. It's sort of, whoever the younger one is can stick around. So I would be just very curious to see where he lands next year. Now, look, and I could go either way. He could land in a very good situation where someone signs him to be the starter next year. I mean, I think people would probably salivate if he ended up on someone like Indianapolis, like you had mentioned before, might look to upgrade. But yeah,
bringing back the Alabama backfield, that'd be exciting.
Well, okay, that's not. I was going to say that's assuming Trent Richardson is like nowhere to be found at that point. But yeah, so I think for me it's just a matter of where he's going to end up next year. And look, he's off to this best season of his career, which is great, but it's also his fourth season. So I don't know. I would, and this may be asking a lot. I'd love to see it again before I bumped him up too much. But for now, I would still be a little cautious with him in a dynasty perspective for sure.
I just think Ingram is the new Cedric Benson. He's a guy that had a slow start to his career.
In a good way or a bad way, Scott?
In a Cedric Benson way. It's a guy that didn't really get a lot of run on his rookie contract, but got out there in free agency and then had a couple of top 20 seasons at the position. So sure. I kind of feel like Ingram's on his way for that too. Conveniently enough, I made a list. Here are some teams that I would love to sign Ingram from a fantasy sense next year. So New Orleans I left on there, but how about Tampa Bay? You'd be pretty excited if he went back there, right?
That would solve literally all of their running back problems in one fell swoop. So yes, I'm sure they would love it. He'd
be a fantasy savior for all of us. Seattle, if they decide to move on from Lynch and maybe get a less expensive option. Yeah. Detroit, I think he's a better player than Joyce Bell. I could see him having fantasy relevance there. The New York Giants, I don't think Rashad Jennings is under contract for next year. And regardless, he's someone that's been hurt a lot in his career. What about Oakland? Maybe they're not sold on Latavius Murray. Denver, we'll talk about them in a moment, but if they sign a guy, you got to take him seriously, obviously. Sure. Jacksonville, not sure what their thoughts are on Denard Robinson's ability to hold up under a heavy workload. Or even Atlanta, Scott, who I think, had hoped Steven Jackson would fill that type of role, but is just completely over the hill. I mean, I think that's what they were wanting to look to get when they signed Steven Jackson, just the 10-year younger model. Yeah, I think you mean Michael Turner in this case, right? Like, isn't he he's the better analogy for Ingram specifically. But to me, that's a terrible fantasy situation. If he goes there, he may not be in my top 20 because they just have a cursed offensive line, and it's doomed to never get better. I don't know who they angered, but they did something. I also wrote down Buffalo as a team that would excite me if he landed on their roster. So I actually think there are a lot more favorable situations for him than not if somebody is willing to give him a contract. So, again, we'll just have to see. All right, let's go on to Denver because this is one where we have a pretty big difference across the board here. So the running back du jour is C.J. Anderson, who I ranked 15th in Dynasty and you ranked 46th. Whereas I have Monte Ball 45th and you 34th. I have Ronnie Hillman 56th and you have him 28th. The major point going into this discussion, I would say, is that all of these guys, as well as rookie Juwan Thompson, are still under contract for next season. Right. Michael, sort this out for me.
I can't. I don't. Can anyone, Scott? Really? I mean, look. If anyone could, I think they would have stepped forward by now. I mean, um, it's almost like who's not injured that week, and they just plug him in. Now, I don't know what their rhyme or reason is for ranking them like they did heading into the season, because I think it's very clear they had Ball first, Hillman second, Anderson third, and Thompson fourth heading into the season, and literally they're just cycling through them. I mean, Ball got hurt, they plugged Hillman in, he did pretty good. Hillman got hurt, they plug Anderson in, and he's done spectacular now. And I'm just waiting for Anderson to get hurt next week and plug Juwan Thompson in and him to go off for 200 yards. So
if the trend continues, he would be the greatest fantasy player ever, Michael.
I think, oh, man, it may be recency, but I don't know what to think of it. I think, for me, Hillman honestly, I ranked him the highest out of the four because it seemed like at his peak I heard the better things about him than either Anderson or Ball, personally. But, again, that's completely not knowing what the plan is for the future. And, look, we could all be wrong, and they could sign, like you said, Mark Ingram next year, and we're all screwed at that point. But, yeah, I think, oh, God, it's so dicey. But at the same time, I think all of them are worth a flyer, at least in a dynasty league, because you just don't know, whose turn is going to come up next week,
I think you're right. I don't really have a criticism for any of your rankings, despite they being so different than mine. Really, I just wanted to bring this up because I wanted to provide a caveat for my own ranking. I have Anderson 15th, but that's almost all about how much value I think he's going to have for the rest of this season. Because, I mean, at this point, I'm ranking him basically as a top 5 or 6 fantasy player through the fantasy playoffs, unless for some strange reason he loses the job, which I don't see happening. So I think
don't say that, Scott.
Well, knocking on wood again. In my mind, he's so valuable in the short term that I had to rank him that highly. But
sure,
he's just part of a dice roll for next year, so we'll have to see. I will say that he's had the most success as a fantasy receiver this year, which I think is really what that's what sort of worked so well over the last couple of years for the Peyton Manning running back. So I'm hopeful that Anderson may be the guy that can emerge there because it seems like he's the one with the highest fantasy upside. All right, now on to a couple other guys we disagree on. I don't know if this is a philosophical difference or what, but I have Knile Davis 30th. You have him 54th. To me, Kansas City's been sort of a running back factory. Jamal Charles, for whatever reason, retired tomorrow, then I feel like I would just plug in Davis as a top 10 back. Do you not see him as being that kind of potential long-term, or do you just think it's going to be too long for him to get the job, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's more the latter. And look, there's not many teams where a backup running back would have no shot at taking the job over, but to me, Kansas City is one of the few ones. And look, Charles is young enough to where I think it's very possible Davis plays out his entire rookie contract without a shot and becomes a free agent. And look, he could sign on as a compliment somewhere else, but I just think he's just roadblocked from any potential, for me anyway, in Kansas City. So, and to me, I don't know. I don't see his talent as being, just head and shoulders above some other guys that he would have a starting job on his own. But and look, like you said, if Jamal Charles had another season-ending injury tomorrow, which he's had before, yeah, Davis immediately becomes a running back too, I think. But to me, that's more of a situation than him. So yeah, I just think it's gonna take too long before anyone gives him a shot.
You're right that it's definitely a risk because sometimes you have a situation like back in the day in San Diego where you had LaDainian Tomlinson playing first string and Michael Turner behind him. We didn't realize how good Turner was because he was buried behind one of the best backs ever. And when he got a chance in Atlanta, he thrived. But alternatively, you can have a situation like in Oakland a few years ago. And hilarious part is I can't even remember the backup's name, but there was a backup that was such a tease in fantasy that when he would get in because he was like injuries or whatever the case was, he would catch the ball and score a lot of touchdowns. But then he signed in Chicago and ended up being the backup there to Matt Forte. Who am I even talking about? Michael Bush.
Oh, yeah.
God. Yeah, I can't even remember his name. That's how big of a fantasy disappointment he became.
Oh, no. He was I'm a Matt Forte owner in several dynasty leagues, and I would always get him as a handcuff, and even then it wasn't worth it, Scotty. I mean, he had the averaging like 2 yards a carry, and that was the funny thing. They always brought him in, at least in Chicago, for the goal line work, and they give him 3 carries, and he'd never get it. But just as a side note, I think, and I remember the season. I mean, they paired him with Darren McFadden, but again, that was under the Hugh Jackson sorcery days when he turned 2 guys into 1,000-yard rushers like it was nothing. So, but to me, Davis is, he may be a fine player, but Charles is just way better than he ever could be, and I just don't think he'll get a shot there. And look, as we've established, the position is such that you could plug in an undrafted free agent, i.e. Cleveland, and still be okay. So it's not like I see a lot of suitors for Davis even when he becomes available.
Possibly, although not all undrafted free agent running backs are created equal. Okay, let's talk about Detroit's backfield, because we have some discrepancies here. This is another frustrating one, obviously. I have Joique Bell 34th at the position. You have him 22nd. Michael, if I told you that Bell only has 21 receptions this season after having 52 and 53 the last 2 seasons, can I change your mind on Bell at all?
I would say talk to me after this season.
Okay.
And it sort of goes back to what you had mentioned with C.J. Anderson, meaning, look, he's the starter. I don't know that anyone there is going to usurp him, certainly not before the end of the season. So to me, that's more about situation as well, because I think, look, with running backs, that plays a big part, and he's in an offense, and he's a younger running back. I just think he's more in line with carries, even if he's not nearly as effective as the guys I have ranked behind him. I think he's just in a very good situation compared to the others. So that's why. But look, that's not to say I think he's a long-term answer. I just think as far as running backs go, he's got a better situation than a lot of other guys.
Michael, what if I also told you that Theo Riddick has also 21 receptions as well as 218 yards and 3 touchdowns as a receiver? That's actually more receiving yards than Bell, despite not really playing before week 6. Does that change your mind at all?
It wouldn't surprise me, Scott. It would not surprise me. But again, for whatever, look, they're making him the starter. I don't see them turning the full load over to Theo Riddick or Reggie Bush anytime soon. Now, look, it's entirely possible they draft a guy next year to possibly take some of those carries. I could see that, but for now, he's ensconced as the starter, and that's why I would roll with him over a lot of other guys.
That's fair. For what it's worth, I have Riddick 43rd at the position, and you have him 81st. I think that might have been our biggest discrepancy at the position. But let's hop over to wide receivers. Again, here, there weren't a ton that I found tremendously exciting. I actually dropped Julio Jones to 10th. You still have him at 2nd. But, I mean, the difference there is really kind of small in my mind. We were listing off a lot of those wide receivers earlier where it's like, I mean, yeah, for now I'm preferring guys like Randall Cobb, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot overall. I will say that Jones has just 6 touchdowns over his last 16 games, and it seems like there's always something every season holding Jones back from being a legit number 1 wide receiver. Obviously, there's a lot of career there in front of him, but I wanted more than I've gotten so far, so I penalized him somewhat. For Randall Cobb, I mentioned a second ago, I have him 5th and you have him 14th. This may be a contract situation, but Cobb, meanwhile, has 14 touchdowns over his last 16 games. So I'm not ignoring that anymore. I feel like it's just going to keep happening unless he leaves Green Bay. I don't think he's going to. Do you think that's a risk?
Personally, I do. I think, I don't want to say his fate was sealed when they re-signed Jordy, but it definitely made it, I think, a little more difficult. And look, Green Bay is a very good team, but they're also going to have to re-sign a lot of guys there soon too, especially on defense. So, but there's no doubt. Look, he's definitely in the mix as far as that next tier of receivers. I mean, look, I still had him 14, and it's kind of funny. I mean, you brought up how there's so many of them. It's almost to the point where you could afford to lay off a receiver in the first round or so because you're going to get a pretty good one on the way back, say in a redraft league or dynasty league, and putting even more of a premium on a top-notch running back or even one of the top-notch quarterbacks. I mean, is Is that fair to say that there's just too many good wide receivers to spend a first-round pick on them?
It's an option. Alternatively, you might want to just grab 2 of those guys because that's what would really give you a huge advantage in dynasty formats. Because don't you just feel a lot better about the long-term success of Julio Jones than any running back at all, frankly? I get that the position at running back is so much more valuable, but I feel a lot better about any of these guys' production in 3 years than I would for any of the running backs.
Sure. Oh, and I could certainly go either way. I think it's a real question of which kind of format you're in, as opposed to redraft or dynasty. If you're in a redraft league, you need a top tier running back, I think, to not to compete, but to at least have a pretty good shot at a championship. Whereas in dynasty, yeah, I completely agree. There's just a bunch of receivers under the age of 26 that I think you would be very happy to spend your first 2 picks on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, the next guy on the list, this one kind of blew my mind how far apart we are. Emmanuel Sanders. I have him 14th. You have him 44th.
Mm-hmm.
So who's the number 4 wide receiver in fantasy this season? How do you have Sanders 44th?
That's another case of situation for me. Look, he's very good, and 44th that may be too low. I could probably bump him up a bit, but as far as 14th, that to me just seems high because I think, with the exception of Thomas there, who I think has carved out a fairly permanent role in that offense, to me a lot of those parts are just interchangeable for me personally. Whether it's look, even Julius Thomas, who they have yet to re-sign, I think is at risk for not coming back there next year. And look, they drafted Latimer, who could either plug into Welker's role or some other role at some point. So to me, it's more about situation there than anything. And look, that's not to say in the next year or two Sanders is going to be very good and even a top 10 option, but long term, it's sort of like what you said with those receivers at the top tier. I would feel much better with a younger guy going forward than I think with him in the long term.
Well, I just think you're crazy on this front. I think Sanders is a moral lock to be top 10 at wide receiver next year. And if you told me that Sanders was going to be a top 10 wide receiver next year and then never play again in the NFL, I'd still have him inside my top 30 at the position. So I guess that's just a big difference of opinion there. We already talked about our difference on Josh Gordon and how that's related to off-field concerns. So let's hop over to tight end. Tight end, again, we were like quarterback kind of similar, especially at the top. We actually had the same top 6, except that we flip-flopped the orders of our 5th and 6th guys. So we both have Gronkowski, Graham, Thomas, then Greg Olsen, Martellus Bennett, and Travis Kelce, where I have Bennett ahead of Kelce and you have Kelce ahead of Bennett. I get that too. I love Kelce. I wish that he got more work. But then we have some pretty major discrepancies after that, which makes sense because we sort of run out of the tier 1 and even tier 2 guys there, and it becomes a pretty big question. So here is the big one. I have Delaney Walker 7th. You have him 22nd. And apparently it's just me because I'm the only – well, okay, there's one other ranker that has Walker even in the top 20. So let me make my case for Walker. He just turned 30. That's not that old for a tight end. In fact, you really don't expect tight ends to start becoming productive until they're mid to late 20s in the first place. That's kind of been the case for Walker. Did you know Walker is on pace for 1,050 yards and 6 or 7 touchdowns for a full 16-game pace this year? I think he actually missed a game, but that's sort of his prorated statistics there. Walker is a huge part of Tennessee's offense. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier among running backs, but I feel like Walker had a little bit of Michael Turner syndrome where he was buried behind the really talented Vernon Davis on your San Francisco 49ers, and now that he's the guy in Tennessee, he's the guy, and he's like a legit top 10 option. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I could see that. Like you alluded to, there's not much, honestly, much difference between the guys after that sort of top tier and even guys in the 20 range, quite honestly. It's a very fluid situation, that's for sure. But I don't know, man. For me, look, the age is a little bit of a concern, even though I know, like you said, they don't really come into their own until their late 20s. But I don't know. It's a matter of the team he's on, which again, I can see the flip side of that. If you're on a bad team and you're chucking it all the time, that that can be a pretty good situation for a fantasy tight end. But I don't know, man. I think, and again, this is the conservative nature. I think I'd like to see another season of him doing this to make sure it's legit before moving him up. And look, maybe 22nd is a little low. And I will admit, personally, I did this ranking before yesterday's game when he absolutely went off again. So,
and to be fair, I did as well, and I did not change him after the game either. I was this high on Walker without saying that.
Well, then I will give you your full credit, Scotty. But yeah, look, I could move him into the teens as well. It's just, I think it just speaks to how little margin there is when you're getting to those kinds of rankings, to where he could easily be a close to a low-end tight end 1 or a tight end 2. I think it could go either way. So I think what would really, I think, help me out with him, especially next year, is to see what quarterback they go with next year, because it's obviously not going to be Jake Locker. And I don't know. I mean, just as a side note, is there a good chance Mettenberger is the starter next year? I mean, it's not like the offense has been the problem there in Tennessee when he started.
I guess it just depends whether or not Marcus Mariota is there for them to take when it's their draft turn, because he may be. And if that's the case, then I think you just have to take him.
Yeah.
I urge you to take a look at Walker's numbers last year, because I think they're better than you remember. Next on the list, though, Jason Morrow. I have him 10th and you have him 21st. Again, this is sort of a situation that become philosophical in nature, too, because obviously Morrow has very little value this season. He's got 34 catches, 291 yards, and 2 touchdowns this year. That sounds really bad, I'm sure. But I just want to point out that's actually pretty good for a rookie tight end. For instance, Jimmy Graham, 31 catches as a rookie. Rob Gronkowski, 42 catches as a rookie. Morrow was on pace to beat those totals, although Gronk, I think, had absurd amounts of touchdowns that year. But the point is, Morrow's kind of gotten worked in earlier than a lot of tight ends get worked in. Are you not optimistic about his future, or are you just that scared of the Jets, especially at quarterback?
Yeah, it's definitely more the latter than the former. That's for sure. Yeah, man. I mean, look, I'm checking the stats for tonight's game. You want to know Mike Vick's stat line through roughly 2.5 quarters?
I do, yes.
Okay, it's 6 of 15 for 42 yards.
Nice. How many fumbles?
I can tell you that. It's not.
I feel like he averages 2 a game. So.
Actually, to his credit, the Jets have no turnovers so far, so that's a plus.
Nice.
But yeah, it's more that. And look, additionally, they've got Percy Harvin there, who, look, should they ever find a competent quarterback, I think a guy like Harvin and Eric Decker, who's still there, are probably going to take priority over Decker or over Amaro. Which, look, that's not to say it won't happen. I fully expect actually a full house cleaning there in the off season. Rex is probably gone. At least I would hope so. And I think they're probably going to hopefully go offensive-minded there as far as whoever the coach is. So I think there's hope, but as the team is constructed now, I think probably Harvin and Decker are going to be first, or at least 1-2 on the priority list. And look, that's another team that could draft a Mariota or some other quarterback. And if they do, that's fantastic, but I still think Amaro's kind of buried on that priority list.
Yeah, that team is desperate for Mariota.
Yeah, they're desperate. Scotty, they'll take Jimmy Clausen at this point, I think. No offense.
Who wouldn't take Jimmy Clausen? That's my question. They're probably going to get Jameis Winston, and it's going to break the world.
Ooh,
so
yeah,
that'll be exciting.
Too. That's okay, too.
Okay, I mentioned Jimmy Graham, too. I wanted to wish Jimmy Graham a happy 28th birthday today. 28 is a really excellent age, so good job, Jimmy. Next up, this is actually the last guy I wrote down on the list, Tim Wright. Wright caught another touchdown on Sunday for the Patriots. That seems to have happened a lot lately. I have him 15th at the position in Dynasty, and I will point out that this is pretty much where I had him last time. You have him 25th still. This is actually really funny because I was looking it up before the show. I'm like, I wonder where Tim Wright ranks. He actually doesn't meet the 25% snap qualification to even be on the leaderboard, which is why it took me like 5 minutes to find him. But would you like to guess where Tim Wright ranks among fantasy tight ends in standard scoring this year?
I'm going to say, I'll say top 15.
You're right. He's the 14th receiver or tight end in fantasy production. He is 4 points behind Heath Miller. And he is ahead of the likes of Zach Ertz, Jared Cook, Owen Daniels, for instance. What do you need to see from Tim Wright to get you a little bit more optimistic? I feel like it can only get better, and he's already been kind of productive.
Yeah, look, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, I don't think it's very hard to match, I think, what Aaron Hernandez did in that role a couple years ago. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's going to be very tough. But at the same time, I think there's definitely a place for him. And look, it's very possible he moves up further on the list. I mean, it's just a matter of how New England uses him. And look, I think we've learned there's only one certainty in a New England Patriot offense, and that's Tom Brady to Rob Gronkowski. Other than that, I mean, it's just wide open. I mean, hell, Julian Edelman had a 10-catch day yesterday, and that was after, I think, a 2-catch day. So, but again, that's to me, I don't know. I would like to see his role a little more defined before moving him up into the solid tight end 2 status. But look, I certainly get it. There's definitely more upside with him than a lot of the guys in front of him.
Yeah, and really with New England at the end of the year, the production's going to be there for everyone. I mean, obviously Gronk is a monster, but beyond that, I mean, both the major wide receivers, LaFell and Edelman, they're going to be top 25 at the position when the season ends. Vereen's going to be top 25 among running backs. And if you'll give me this Stephen Ridley plus Jonas Gray conglomerate, they'll probably be top 25 too. So everybody gets the production when the day is done, but it's just really hit or miss. That's really frustrating for the running back and wide receiver owners. But honestly, it's less frustrating for their tight end owners because pretty much everyone outside the top 4 is really hit or miss at the position. So I think we're at the point where it makes more sense to just ride with Wright, hope the touchdown comes, hope maybe the targets come. He's had a couple games with a lot of receptions too. Again, it's that weird game plan situation. And check on Bill Belichick's DraftKings plays before you make any calls in a given week. But, Wright had a great year as a rookie, actually an historically great year last year. And I feel like New England they did a New England thing. They took a guy that the Tampa Bay didn't want because they drafted a physical freak in Austin Seferian-Jenkins, and they're going to turn him into a really productive player.
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible. I couldn't fault you for that. And just for the record, Scott, we do have our first Jets turnover with a blocked kick return for a touchdown. So,
do you know who blocked the kick?
It was Manny Lawson, of course.
Okay.
So
now that we're an hour into the show, I feel like I can go on this aside. I play in this ridiculously amazing format that I play in with a bunch of my college and high school friends. That my friend Ben, he invented the format back in like 2003, and it's fantastic. And if you block a kick, it's an IDP league, you get 15 points. So they are like total swingers. It's the best thing you can do in fantasy in our league is block a kick. And so it's absolutely hysterical. I don't think anybody owns Manny Lawson, though. I was hoping that maybe. I was
going to say, he just recovered, Scotty. He didn't actually block the kick. I'll have to get back to you.
Interesting.
No, I'm sorry. Of all people, it was Anthony Dixon who blocked the punt. So I don't know if your league gives offensive players that chance, but if they did, he just hit the jackpot.
Oh, so he was in on the block team? This is like Buffalo Bills running back Anthony Dixon? I guess he's a special teams player. Yeah.
Blocked by A. Dixon. So
interesting. That's fascinating. All right, Michael. Well, I think this was a good show. We might have snuck in under an hour, but probably not. I hope everybody stuck with this far. I hope everybody enjoys their Thanksgiving. I'm not really sure what the other PFFers are going to do with podcasts this week, but take a look on iTunes, see if anything else comes back. Otherwise, have a lot to eat, and then we'll catch you again next week.